started, Councillor Lafferty, you could certainly go ahead and do that. Thanks. Okay. Do you want to start the recording, please, Leona?
Welcome.
Yes, that's your recording now.
Thank you very much. First item on our agenda, imagine, would be apologies.
Chair, I've got apologies from Councillor Buchanan and from Dorothy Graham.
Okay. Okay. Eamon, do you want to make an announcement regarding 11 o'clock, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. As everyone will know, this is the 11th of November and it's Armistice Day. So what's happening in council buildings where possible is that there's the bells being sounded for a 2-minute silence. So it was just to let members know that if we did reach 11 o'clock this morning, we would stop, I think, for a minute's silence, Chair, with your agreement, just so that people could reflect on the armistice, if that's okay.
Just a minute silence.
I think a minute, because it's a virtual meeting, Chair, I think a minute will be appropriate.
Okay. Right. What's the next item on the agenda?
Thank you, convener. The report provides Education Committee with details about the Scottish Government's education reform consultation and proposals for a response from East Renfrewshire. In June 2021, the OECD published the first of 2 reports, Scotland's Curriculum for Excellence into the Future. And whilst this report highlighted the impact of Curriculum for Excellence in Scottish education, it also set out 12 recommendations for further improvement. The Scottish Government accepted all 12 recommendations and as part of that took the decision that the SQA would be replaced and that the functions of Education Scotland would be reviewed with the removal of the inspectorate and the establishment of a separate organisation. In August 2021, the OECD published the second of the reports, Upper Secondary Education Student Assessment in Scotland, a Comparative Perspective. And this report also set out a number of possible ways in which improvements could be made, particularly to align the curriculum and assessment in the senior phase. Professor Ken Muir, the former Chief Executive of the General Teaching Council of Scotland, was asked to take forward the reform of SQA and Education Scotland in his role as an independent advisor to the Scottish Government. And a key element of his work is a national consultation designed to seek views of all the stakeholders and inform the recommendations relating to the future shape of the 2 national agencies. The consultation was published on the 30th of September and runs until the 26th of November. Paragraph 9 sets out the range of stakeholders that the department is consulting with, and views from the various meetings will be collated to form the overall East Renfrewshire response. Committee will be aware that to gather their views, elected members along with members of Education Committee have been invited to participate in a session following this meeting of the committee. As the next meeting of the Education Committee will not be until after the consultation ends, it's been proposed to establish a short-term working group to consider the responses from all the stakeholders as outlined above and to finalise and submit a response on behalf of the Council. The response would be submitted to the next meeting of the committee for homologation. Membership of the working group would comprise of the convener, Councillor Lafferty, leader of the council, and leader of the Conservative Group and Education spokesperson, Councillor Wallace. Education Committee is asked to note the education reform consultation, note that the changes to Scotland's national education agencies is likely to have a significant implications for education in East Renfrewshire, agree to the establishment of the Short Life Working Group comprising of Councillors Lafferty, Buchanan and Wallace to agree the East Renfrewshire response prior to any submission, and agree that the final submission be submitted for homologation to the next Education Committee meeting on the 3rd of February 2022. Thank you, convener.
Can't hear you, Alan. Can't hear Alan.
Oh, we're all my James wasted. You're okay. I noticed, Charlie, that you are not on. Oh, you are. We need you to mute. We're getting a bit of an echo. Craig. Can I leave you to sort it? Comment.
Is it me? Can I just say that, as you know, I've got a member of this committee living up the stairs from me at present, Ken Muir's committee, and he's informed me that the SQA are fighting their corner like mad, but Shirley Ann Somerville has told them to be very bold. So I think they are making quite far-reaching. I am not obviously party to what they're saying, but I know that the SQA are trying to fight their corner quite vociferously in any consultations there are. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Jenny. There's a surprise dictat from Edinburgh. Any comments, folks? Thank you very much. Note this report. And
Sorry, Chair, sorry to interrupt, but Councillor Wallace and I think Provost would like to come in and comment.
oh, thank you. Sorry, God.
Thank you, Councillor Lafferty. I'm curious as to how we're supposed to have input on how SQA and such organisations are to be organised when we don't know yet what it is they're supposed to do. Is it not a bit back to front? If I could maybe pose that question to the Director. Thanks.
Thanks, God.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace. I think that is my own personal view is that I think that it is a challenge to look at the role of any new organisation, SQA and Education Scotland, without looking at the other 12 recommendations of the OECD report. There is now an implementation plan that has been published by the Scottish Government. However, as you perhaps highlighted in your question, for me, there would have been benefit in agreeing and looking at the vision more widely, looking at how we align the senior phase and the curriculum and pedagogy before agreeing any changes to those organisations. But that decision was made to progress with that one more quickly, which is, and we'll obviously explore the sort of response to the consultation in the session afterwards. But I think that's probably why Professor Muir has included sections around curriculum and assessment, around the vision, and around roles and responsibilities within his consultation, seeking people's views because of the interconnected nature. But yes, in my view, it would have been good to decide the future direction and then review the organisations.
Okay. Supplementary, Councillor Wallace.
Yeah, just curious as to, do we then have to make certain assumptions when we make our recommendations or our response? Thank you.
Okay. Somebody mentioned Provost being president.
Yes. Could I ask a question, Alan? I'm struggling to hear you a wee bit. I think the link's very bad.
Sorry about that. What are you?
Okay, can I fire ahead? I don't want to say maybe too much at this stage, given that we're having a session later, but I do think this consultation is very important for East Renfrewshire. You know, I'm sure the OECD reports were the ones that were delayed to after the election, because of the embarrassment of Scottish Government, because it would suggest all the changes to the curriculum for excellence haven't really worked. And some of the concerns that we raised as a council at the time of these changes, I think, are coming home to roost. But I just think it's the general direction of travel. We don't seem to inspect schools the way we used to. And we see that this is now getting, this particular function is getting hived off from Education Scotland. So I'd be interested to know how that's going to be taken forward in the future. When we have our discussion and the results, and again, I don't want to say too much on that, but I think everybody would have a bit of a concern about the so-called jump in exam results throughout the country. You know, when teaching for the period of the COVID pandemic has been so severely disrupted, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I think we have a culture in Scotland of not facing up to problems. I don't think the changes to curriculum for excellence have worked the way we wanted them to work. I think there needs to be significant changes. I think the SQA are getting abolished because, you know, they get hung out to dry in the last couple of years because of the political problems that the government faced and had to back down because of these large jumps and attainment based in teacher assessments. But I think from East Renfrewshire's point of view, I mean, right from 1995, when this authority came into being, we have confronted problems and we've driven change. And we've got the three group leaders making the response, which is fine, but I hope they will make a very robust response and not shy away from doing what's necessary. You know, you do need to inspect, you do need to, I think, assess pupils, and all of that needs to be done robustly and honestly. Because if you don't assess schools, and I know it can be quite painful for us all, particularly if you're in the administration or you're in power, you really don't know, you know, that you're failing and how to drive change to improve. So I just think the culture in Scotland seems to be, you know, scale back in evaluating schools, move on to continuous assessment for pupils. We're all brilliant and don't really confront the real problems that are there. So I think people move to this area because they have a belief that the schools are better than other areas. If you look at house prices, they're at 100,000 on average more than the rest of the west of Scotland, because this is an area that people want to move to, largely because of education. So I don't think we want to have a system where we are not able to demonstrate that our schools are better than schools in other areas. It's important for us as an authority. I think it's something that's valued by our residents, and I hope whatever we say to this consultation kind of protects the very good reputation we have in education and want to continue into the future. But maybe we can have a better discussion of that at the session later this morning. Thanks, that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks very much, Provost. Very grateful for that enlightened response. Any other comments? Questions? Fine. See, you're proud of that until later on. Fair enough. What's the next item on the agenda? I have to report I've had some problem with my laptop, as you may have from the sound.
The next agenda item, Chair, is the Sqa Results Presentation.
Mr. McCaig, I understand, is going to make a presentation, as he has in the previous year, and the floor to Joe.
Good morning, all, once again. Yeah, it's my opportunity this morning to follow up on the statement that was made back in September to committee and to elected members on the performance of our establishments in the recent SQA assessments, and also to take into consideration some of the performance of our primary school establishments and also our young people on points of exit from our schools and into education, employment and training. And so this gives me the opportunity this morning to go through some analysis with you and to make you aware of the performance both at a school and local authority level. I'll take over my screen. If you can just confirm, hopefully, that everyone can see the slides which are now in front of you, hopefully. Yeah, I can see most people nodding, so I assume that that's now in front of your screen. So if there are any issues, please let me know as we go through if the screen freezes and such like. I think, like similar to some of you this morning, my connection is not as good as it normally would be. In terms of the presentation this morning then, I'd like to break the presentation up, I suppose, into some of those key areas and visions which we hold as an education department, focusing on excellence of outcomes for our children and young people, and also equity in terms of closing attainment gaps, particularly in relation to those related to poverty or affluence levels, and any other factors which we are currently focusing on as a department and within our educational establishments, both within the broad general education, within the primary sector, and then within the senior phase, and also, as I've already previously mentioned, looking at post-school outcomes. So I thought I'd just start off by, I suppose, highlighting some of the key points, and I'll return to these at the end of the slide as a reminder, but sometimes having these at the beginning of the slide can align your thoughts and your views as you go through some of the slides to make you aware of some of the key points which might be of interest to you. So in terms of the first one, they're looking at the primary sector and the outcomes for our children within the broad general education. In 2020-2021, we saw a slight decrease across the 4 curricular areas within the broad general education. And that had the greatest impact on those young people, I suppose, within our equity groups, as we would define them. We saw a strong performance of our pupils in the senior phase, continuing on from the performance in previous years and building on from success rates at S4 into S5 and into S6. And then finally, in terms of those post-school destinations, and looking, I suppose, more longer term at the Scottish Government's participation measure and looking at the proportion of pupils when they leave school who remain within education, employment and training. So first of all, looking at the broad general education and with that focus on advancing excellence, I just thought it'd be worthwhile to remind us of the department's vision, ensuring that every child achieves the highest standards in literacy and numeracy. And then some of the impacts and outcomes that we work towards, as you can imagine, that's improving the attainment within literacy and numeracy without the years of the broad general education. And we're quite open in our aspiration to be the highest performing mainland local authority as measured by those curriculum for excellence levels. You'll recall this slide from previous presentations in previous years, and this table allows us to look at the proportion of our children who are attaining the appropriate levels across the stages of primary 1, 4 and 7. The CFE data within the broad general education was not collected in 2019-20 as a consequence of the impact of COVID, both at the primary and secondary sector. And for 2020-21, the CFE data was also not collected within the secondary sector as a consequence of the alternative certification model. Within the table, within the first row here, you can see the proportion of children across those 3 stages who attained the appropriate levels in reading. In 2020-21, the most recent year, that was just over 90% at 90.3%. And when we compare that to the last year in which we gathered that data, it was a reduction of about 0.4%, down by just under half a percentage point from where we were previously. And in 18-19, we were regarded as being the highest performing local authority in Scotland in that measure. Nationally, these results have not yet been published, and so we're not able to compare our performance with 2020-21. However, with these particular values as they are this year for 2020-2021, that would have placed us still within the highest performing local authority in Scotland, should those measures remain relatively the same. The second row below, you can see the national position. So for reading nationally, the proportion of young people who were attaining that level was 80% in 18-19. As we go down through the different areas, you can see that within writing, we saw a reduction of about 1 percentage point from where we were previously. In talking and listening, we've decreased again by roughly about a half a percentage point. And in the overall literacy measure, which is for children and young people who attain reading, writing and talking and listening collectively, we saw a reduction there again of about half a percentage point. In terms of numeracy, again, similar to the previous areas, and it's just about under 1 percentage point of a change from where we were previously back in 18-19. So over the piece from 2015-16, when we initially started collecting these values, you can see that for 2020-2021, overall is still maintaining about a 2 percentage point increase. In writing, that's a 1 percentage increase. talking listening 3%, in literacy 3%, and in numeracy 1%. So we've saw a bit of an impact in 2021 in terms of those attainments of children within the primary sector, and I suppose a bit of a hit in terms of that trend that we've saw over the last 3 to 4 years of continuous improvement. Looking at equity within this section, again, having on the screen our first point, which is our vision, ensuring that every child has the same opportunity to succeed and close those gaps, and then focusing on closing those gaps for disadvantaged children and young people within these areas. First of all, then, looking at those proportion of pupils in reading who attain the appropriate level. Along the bottom of the slide, hopefully you'll note the number of children who are being included within this measure. So the first of the 3 columns indicates all pupils across P1, 4 and 7. We then include those pupils who are recorded as being entitled to a free school meal, and then those pupils who reside within deciles 1 and 2. The free school meal indicator is becoming a more difficult one to analyse, given that at this particular point in time, all children across P1 to 4 are now entitled to a free school meal. From January, that will be inclusive of primary 5, and from next August, that will include primary 6 and 7. And so that makes it more difficult for us to analyse that information, as we no longer require parents or carers to apply for that particular right. And so it makes it difficult for us to gather that information. Just bringing in the information then over the last 3 years, 4 years, as you can see here on the screen, and looking at what's been the difference over that period of time. As you can see, until 2018-19, for all pupils, the percentage increase was about 2%. For those entitled to a free school meal, it increased by about 3%. And for those from deciles 1 and 2, it increased by about 7 percentage points. So I think that demonstrates that the work of the department and our establishments was successful in working towards closing that attainment equity gap. Most recently in 2021, if we compare from this year to the most recent year, we can see that for overall that's reduced to about 90%, down by 1 percentage point. Conversely, free school meals have continued to increase again from last year to about 74 percentage points, whilst those in decile 1 to 2 areas have decreased by about 6 percentage points from the most recent position in 2018-19. So with the exception, I suppose, of free school meals, when we look at those from deciles 1 and 2, it suggests that we've returned to the position of where we were back in 15-16 and 16-17, despite those increases that we'd made over the intermittent years between that point in time. In terms of numeracy then, so looking at numeracy as a measure with the same chart as before, so hopefully you'll be adjusted to looking at this one. Just bringing in the same values as before, and then looking at the performance over those 3 years, we can see that for all children and young people, there had been an increase of 1 percentage point to about 91%. And you'll recall previously, for nationally, that value was about 78% of young people were attaining. So for East Renfrewshire at 91, it was a very, very strong performance for us, as we would expect. For those pupils from a free school meal background, an increase of 3%, and deciles 1 and 2, an increase of about 8 percentage points. And when we compare like for like with 2018-19 and 2021, we can see again the decreases within those areas of about 1 percentage point, 3 percentage points, and 5 percentage points. And again, taking us back to a fairly similar position to where we were back in 15-16 and 16-17. This analysis actually correlates with the findings of the Education Scotland report in January. Their equity audit did comment upon the fact that from their analysis, the children and young people most likely to be impacted in terms of their attainment were those from least affluent areas, as well as those children at points of transition. And we also found that across primary 1, 4 and 7, our primary 1 children were most adversely affected by the lockdown and the impact on their attainment. Moving on to the senior phase then, and our SQA analysis. Again, we do not hide from the fact that we want to be the highest performing mainland council as measured by national exams, and to look towards improving attainment for all our young people. Looking at some of the breadth and depth measures then that we look at, and primarily looking at those young people in S4 and those who attained 5 or more awards at SEQF level 5 or national 5 as a percentage of the school's roll. In terms of the analysis, we're focused on the last 3 years, so that's been 2019, 20 and 21, given that over those 3 years we have had 3 distinct and different assessment models in place. So 2019 was that traditional examination diet. 2020 we moved into teacher judgments of children's learning, and then for 2021 we moved into a localised assessment type model that had been valid and reliable through moderation type processes. So we're focused on those most recent 3 years. And bringing in the proportion of our S4 pupils who have attained that measure of 5 or more awards at National 5. We can see that overall at an authority level, we've remained fairly consistent over the last 3 years, a slight increase of about 1 percentage point, from 78 to 79%, after an increase last year to 81%, and that's a similar trend to what we have noted nationally. In terms of the measure, 79% is our second highest recorded value in this measure after last year's high of 81%. And you can see across each of our individual establishments, there's a fairly similar trend to the performance, perhaps with the exception of St Luke's High School, where we saw an increase of about 14 percentage points from their performance back in 2019. However, layering into this chart the virtual comparator value, this is a measure which is used to compare our establishments against a national measure of a school, if you like, a hypothetical school of 10 times the number of pupils to that school with similar characteristics for the children and young people. I suppose a measure of where we should be aiming to attain it as a minimum. You can see that as an authority, we're around about 20 percentage points above that virtual comparator, showing that we are significantly performing above what would be regarded as being the expectation, I suppose, as a minimum of 59%. And you can see that similarly that's the case across all of our establishments. And similarly that St Luke's, as I mentioned previously, is now performing at a similar level to Barrhead High School in terms of those outcomes, and we would hope that they would be in advance of that virtual comparator. Moving on then to look at S5 pupils, again a similar measure, but this time looking at 5 or more awards at a higher level. And again, layering in those values over the last 3 years, we can see that over 2019 through to 2021, we saw an increase of about 6 percentage points in terms of those levels of attainment for our young people in terms of that measure. We can see some of the notable increases for our schools, Wood Farm High School increasing by around about 12 percentage points, Eastwood by about 13 percentage points. And when we compare against our virtual comparator, again, you can see that we performed very well in that measure against what would be the minimum expectation. So for us as a council, it's about 29% against similar type pupils across the country, and we're performing at about 50% of that measure. When we move on then to look at S6 pupils, and again, similarly, that 5 or more award at higher as a key indicator of outcomes and accessing to further and higher education. Again, focusing on the last 3 years, we can see that we've increased that measure by around about 7 percentage points over that period of time, from 58% to 65%. And we can see that that, in effect, is our highest performance in that measure for 5 or more hires by the end of S6 at 65%. In terms of some of our schools, notably, you can see an increase as well at St Ninian's to 75%. And in actual fact, that 75% is the second highest recorded by St Ninian's. Their highest recorded value was back in 2016, so quite some time ago for St Ninian's, but certainly that's the second highest recorded value for the school at 75%, and a very high success rate for the young people in the school. And similarly for our schools, you can see that performance has improved over the piece in general. Against our virtual comparator, again, a similar picture, which shows that as an authority level and within our own individual schools, we are performing at or in excess of our virtual comparator within each of our establishments and across the council. In terms of that improvement of ATC awards at National 5 and higher and in A awards, the increase in attainment is similar to the attainment that we saw nationally in terms of those outcomes also. The values that we saw at S5 and S6 follow on from previous years of high performance at S4. Looking at one of the curricular areas then, particularly looking at maths, and again, it's a very similar picture for literacy, so I've just focused on maths rather than English as well as an additional slide. But looking at the proportion of young people who have attained A to D awards in maths as a particular focus. And along the bottom, what you will notice here initially over the last 3 years is the proportion of our young people who have been presented for National 5 mathematics. and in comparison to the national picture. So nationally, in 2021, just under 44% of young people in S4 were presented at National 5 Maths. That was actually a decrease of just under 5,000 pupils this year nationally being presented for National 5 Maths, whereas for East Renfrewshire, we saw that continuous increase to just under 81% of our young people being presented and given the opportunity to make that award. And you can see that that's been the case over the last 3 years, and that is in contrast to a decrease nationally, where it's went from 48% in 2019 to just under 44% this year in maths. Some of that has been overtaken by other courses, such as applications of maths, but certainly a decrease overall. And then just layering in the quality of awards for maths in each of the last 3 years. Again, you can see that increased by about 2 percentage points over the last 3 years, so very consistent in terms of the outcomes in maths, as opposed to, I suppose, nationally was a bit of a bigger increase of about 5 percentage points over the piece. And then just filtering through in terms of the B and C's and D awards, you can see that for mathematics, a fairly consistent picture over the 3 years, with only around about 3% of our presented children not attaining National 5 in that measure. And of course, that will be followed up by their opportunity to attain National 4 type awards. Nationally then, in terms of ATCs for East Renfrewshire, around about 72% of our S4 pupils attain National 5 Maths. If we include applications of maths, that goes to 75%. And when we compare that against the national picture, 35% of S4 pupils across Scotland attained National 5 Maths in comparison to our 72%. And in terms of application of maths, if we include that also, around about 39% of young people attain National 5 Maths or application of maths nationally, whereas for East Renfrewshire, that's 75% of our young people are attaining National 5 Maths or application of maths. When we extend that slightly to include numeracy in its wider form, that increases for East Renfrewshire to about 82% against a virtual comparator of 67%. So the virtual comparator again gives us a similar type cohort of young people nationally and shows that we are performing significantly above that. In terms of presentations at National 5 overall, as a proportion of all presentations, you can see that in 2021, just under 89% of our presentations were made at National 5 level, with the remaining 11% being spread across National 3, National 4, etc. In terms of those ATC awards, again, you can see that there's a similar pattern to the previous slide. After an all-time high in 2020 of 96%, that reduced slightly this year to about 93%. And you'll see that pattern similar across each of our establishments. And again, that pattern is replicated nationally. Nationally, at National 5 Awards, ATC Awards were around about 86%. So we're performing around about 7% above that in terms of those presentation rates. In terms of the quality of awards over a period of time, going back to 2007, and just looking at 8 or more awards at National 5, 8 or more A awards at National 5 initially, we can see the progress that's been made over that period of time. So from 2007, when 33% of S4 pupils were attaining 8 awards at National 5, to this year it's now at 59%, a significant increase over that period of time. And similarly, when we look at 8 or more National 5A awards, an increase from about 11% to 31% over that period of time. Moving on to higher awards, so S5 pupils with 5 hires, 23% back in 2007, now around about 50% of our S5 pupils were attaining 5 or more awards at higher. And when we look at the quality of those awards, and when we look at 5 or more hires, that's increased from 5% in 2007 to around about 25% of our S5 pupils attain 5 or more hires this year. Again, those increases align with the increases nationally. I thought it worthwhile just looking at a brief case study from one of our secondary schools this year in terms of their approach to improving attainment for S4 pupils in 2021. And this case study related to, I suppose, study skills, a programme of study skills for children, young people in S4 with identified groups and looking at the impact that would have for them. In terms of the process, then I thought I'd very briefly highlight the process the school went through. They identified S4 pupils, looking at particular learners, most notably those in the lowest performing 20% of young people. Also through discussion with year heads and pastoral heads in terms of pupils and young people who would perhaps be of benefit to be involved in such a programme over a period of time. The school then looks to baseline that information to identify those young people and where they are at the beginning of the programme, and therefore allow them to consider the success or otherwise. Then to apply those targeted interventions of study skills, assessment skills, support from appropriate members of staff across the school on a regular basis, on an ongoing basis. Then the opportunity to consider that impact and before re-evaluating and refining the programme moving forward. And that's what's happened in this particular example, where the programme is now in its second year, given the success that was discovered most recently in 2020-21 for these young people. What was the impact of that programme then? What did some of those measures tell us from the interventions? For one child, they identified here initially was a boy who had of ethnic minority background and who had additional support needs. And looking at some of the details of the curricular changes, you can see here for chemistry, the young person's attainment improved from an F, a projected F, no award at that particular point in time, to a D. In English, from a band C to an A. From geography, an F to an A. Graphics, a B to an A. History, an F to an A. And maths, from an F award to an A. And what did that mean then in terms of their insight points, the cumulative bag of qualifications, if you like? That young person had improved from around about 286 points to 582 points. And it meant that from September in 2020, when they were projected to be attaining about 4 awards at National 5, they actually went on to attain 8 awards by the end of the year. I'll simply layer in the next two and give you a few moments to look over those rather than reading through them for you, but you can see, again, for the second child, in this case it was a boy who was from a lower decile background, decile 1 area, who had been projected for 6 awards and actually went on to attain 8 awards. And then finally for another young boy who was from an ethnic minority background and who had additional support needs, again projected to attain 5 awards, but actually went on to attain 7 awards by the end of the academic year. Okay, so moving on to look at some of the equity factors in terms of the senior phase. And first of all, looking at a similar chart to what's already been presented, for 5 or more awards at SCQF Level 5, National 5, as a percentage of the S4 roll, but particularly focusing this time on those children and young people entitled to a free school meal, and what did their performance look like over the last 3 years. Again, elected members will note the very small number of these young people in comparison to the cohort of the year stage. Less than 1 in 10 would be regarded as being entitled to a free school meal. And you'll notice how that varies across different establishments, from Williamwood High School with around about 10 pupils to Barrhead with 19 pupils. And when we consider the difference in the overall school roll, that's a significant difference. As you can see as well, the proportion of those pupils is not equidistant in terms of those establishments. So from a school such as Williamwood High School, with around about 4% of their cohort entitled to a free school meal in S4, to Barrhead, when it was about 39% of young people entitled to a free school meal. And just layering in the values end over the last 3 years, we can see that over the last 3 years, the proportion of those young people attaining that measure has actually decreased by around about 5 percentage points. And again, shows, I believe, a bit of an impact from, I suppose, lockdown and the measures of COVID over that period of time for those particular learners. And again, that was something that was reiterated by Education Scotland in their analysis nationally. I've also layered in the virtual comparator for these young people to demonstrate how that compares against what would be the minimum expectation. And whilst for us as a department, we are obviously disappointed with that decrease of about 5 percentage points, we can see that we are still significantly above the expectation, I suppose, for those types of pupils by about 10 percentage points. And we can see that for our establishments, with the exception of St Luke's High School, we can see that across the other areas, those schools were able to outperform that virtual comparator. The values I've layered in the boxes above each school is the percentage of all the children who attain that measure. And so you can see where the gaps exist and where some of the largest gaps are that we will be looking to focus on. So you can see, for example, at Williamwood High School, there was a gap of about 35 percentage points between the cohort as a whole and those entitled to a free school meal. St Luke's and Barrhead at around about 29 percentage points of a gap, 28 percentage points of a gap. And the only school really to narrow that gap last year was Eastwood High School with around about 77% of those entitled to a free school meal attaining against 76% of the cohort in its entirety. When we look at the insight points, elected members will be familiar with the type of chart I'm about to display with the bubble plots. Within this chart, this makes a comparison of the performance of East Renfrewshire's young people against the national average for our S6 pupils at the point of exit. So the bubbles will display the proportion of the number of pupils we have in each of these groups. So you can see that as we go from right to left, we have smaller bubbles, which indicates a smaller number of young people, with a larger number of young people in these upper decile groups for us in authority. The line demonstrates the progression in terms of the raising of attainment as we go through those deciles. And of course, as you can imagine, it's our aspiration that that line is as flat as possible, as it would show equal outcomes for all our learners, and as high as possible for the excellence factor. When we compare that against the position nationally, you can see that for each of those decile areas, our performance is higher than the national perspective for each of those areas. And in fact, for our young people in deciles 1 to 3, the performance there is similar to those in deciles 4 to 6 nationally. As I've already mentioned, the virtual comparator can often be regarded as a better comparison, as it compares against 10 times the number of pupils with similar characteristics. And just layering in those particular values for East Renfrewshire this year against the virtual comparator, again, layering in our bubble plots against the virtual comparator, we can see that for our virtual comparator, we perform above, and in some cases significantly above, our virtual comparator. As you can see here for decile group 1, young people significantly above our comparator. What does that actually mean when we compare it? What does that actually result in? So for decile 1 to 3 pupils, the average gap between East Renfrewshire and the virtual comparator was about 207 points, and that equates to an additional A award at higher for those young people. So in general, we can say on average, our young people in decile groups 1 to 3 attain an A award at higher more than their virtual comparator. It's a similar picture for 4 to 7, with a gap of about 219 points, and for deciles 8 to 10, the gap is about 165 points in favour of East Renfrewshire children, which equates to an extra C award at higher when we consider it in terms of awards. However, obviously, as I've mentioned already, our aspiration is for that line to be high and to be flat. And what that does suggest is with that grading is that on average, for each different decile group that our young people reside within, there's an increase of 51 points. So between a child in decile 1 and a child in decile 2, there is on average a gap of 51 points. And when we compare that against our decile 1 and decile 10 groups, what does that really mean? Well, that means that there's a difference of about 456 points on average between a young person in decile 1 and a young person in decile 10. And what does that equate to? Well, that can equate to 2 A awards at higher or 1 B award at advanced higher in terms of those outcomes. So whilst of course we're pleased that our performance is above our virtual comparator and shows that we are having a positive impact for all our learners, we are still very much aspirational that that gap is reduced as much as possible and that we continue to focus on all our young pupils and closing those equity gaps. Finally then, moving on to look at some of our leaver destinations and vocational qualifications. This chart demonstrates the proportion of our school leavers who attained one or more vocational qualifications at the point of exit. That's at SEQF level 6 or better, so a vocational qualification which would be regarded as the equivalent of a higher award. And what you can see from this chart is that for East Renfrewshire, we had the highest rate of our S6 pupils who left school with, any leaver, I should say, who left school with a vocational qualification against all other 31 local authorities. It's just under 16% of our cohort. And I think that demonstrates that whilst our children do attain very well academically, there is that holistic approach to their education, ensuring that they do have opportunities for vocational qualifications and the embedding of those opportunities within school curriculum. Nationally, you can see the average there at about 8 percentage points, so we're almost double the national average. And in terms of our leavers, that is the highest proportion of pupils having that qualification. Looking at our leavers then in terms of the gaps between deciles 1 and 2 and deciles 9s, again, those quintile 1s and quintile 5s, and having a look at the variation across each of the last 4 to 5 years, and again making a comparison with our virtual comparator. So over the piece, we can see that for each of those groups, our performance is above the virtual comparator in the most recent year. Again, there's I suppose less headroom for improvement given such a high rate of our leavers entering a positive destination. But over the period of time, we saw an increase for quintile 1, decils 1 and 2 by about 1 percentage points. For decils 9 and 10, we've got that increase of about 0.7%. So whilst both elements are increasing, slightly greater increase for those in decils 1 and 2. But overall, we saw that decrease slightly by just under half a percentage point, no doubt impacted by those within deciles 3 through to deciles 8. This chart looks at the proportion of our young people over a longer period of time, post-school education. So this looks at the participation measure and is a measure which focuses on young people from the ages of 16 to 19 and includes those who are in education, employment and or training. So it allows a bit more a longitudinal analysis to see where our young people are, perhaps 1, 2, as much as 3 years after having left school. And over the last 3 years, we can see that for those young people in deciles 1 and 2, we've improved by just about 2.6 percentage points, being in a positive destination. Again, in a similar improvement at deciles 9 and 10 by about 0.3%. As an authority in 2021, 97.2% of our young people in August 21 were remaining within a positive destination, either education, employment and training, up to and including the age of 19. And what that has demonstrated is that that's the highest level across Scotland at 97.2%. So East Renfrewshire had the highest proportion of young people across the ages of 16 to 19 still participating in a positive destination. And from the most recent element I've added to the slide just now, you can see that that increase has been most keenly felt by deciles 1 and 2, and again does demonstrate to some extent the closing of the gap in this measure. Okay, so that was the last slide in terms of the analysis. Again, I'll just remind you of some of the key points that I think we've touched upon through this slide. And again, I suppose I would just make the point that I made previously at Education Committee back in September. Given the temporary closure of our schools and the remote learning that had to be put in place, once again, it's been a hugely challenging year for our learners, their families, and for our staff. And that despite those obstacles, the school leaders and teaching staff were able to return and continue with remote learning, return to school face-to-face learning, and to result in excellent outcomes for our children and young people over that period of time. And again, I think it's a good opportunity to thank our pupils, parents and staff for their vital contributions throughout that period of time as we move forward into 2021-2022 examination period. I think it's on mute, Councillor Lafferty.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. Can I invite any questions, comments from committee members? I think they'll seem very satisfied and content with the findings of this report. I know it's one of the most keenly anticipated for the reason Provost Fletcher highlighted the public resident look to see how our schools are performing, and I think I'll bring in Provost Fletcher and Councillor Loper.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I think just to say, given the pandemic and the range of the results, before we say anything about them, I think we need to congratulate everybody involved with the director downwards and indeed thank them for the results. And we sometimes take these results for granted, but there's huge dedication and hard work by all the staff in our schools and our directorate, and I do think we owe them grateful thanks, and you know, we shouldn't take these things for granted every year. So well done to everybody. It's very gratifying to see that the good results are broadly continuing. That there's one or two schools that have a couple of odd you know, results coming in, some positive, some less positive. It might be useful if we're able to see some slides and we can have a wee look at them in slower time, just to have a bit more detailed analysis. But I was interested in one particular slide, which was the increase in the numbers of pupils attaining hires. I think it was, and it was almost doubling. I think sometimes more than doubling from 2007 to the present day. So that's great. But the wee comment that Joe made at the end, that it reflected a national trend. So, you know, as everybody's pass rate doubled from 2007 to 2021, and to ask the obvious question that probably everybody else out there would ask, you know, are the exams of the same level? You know, why do we think that the pass rate's doubling? You know, very welcome though that is. Can we be absolutely sure that we're comparing apples with apples?
Joe, if you'll answer that.
Yep, thank you, Provost. Yeah, in terms of those results and the doubling of those are over quite a significant period of time, from 2007 all the way up until 2021. So in terms of that analysis and my comment regarding similar pattern nationally, that comment was more in line with, I suppose, over the past 3 years, from 2019 to 2020 to 2021. We saw a similar trend and pattern in terms of the increase in attainment over that period of time, as opposed to 2007 through to where we are now. I think in terms of where we are as a local authority, I think those charts that looked at the comparison against the virtual comparator is a good indicator that shows that we are atypical in terms of that increase in attainment that we have achieved over that period of time, and shows that our performance from our schools and our young people is significantly above what would be expected, given the approach that we take within East Renfrewshire and the importance that we apply to our education. And I think a lot of those impacts and those improvements have come through those interventions that I mentioned earlier as a good example from one of our schools, and that we see that those interventions are well thought out, they're well planned for, they're based on evidence and research and education, and you know, those opportunities for our staff in terms of their own professional development, and the opportunities that they're afforded in terms of their ability to raise attainment for children and young people has no doubt positively impacted in those outcomes over a long period of time, as you say, from 2007 through to 2021. In terms of the reliability and the validity of the process, and in terms of those assessments, I know I mentioned this previously at Education Committee back in September, but as a local authority, in terms of both of 2020 and 2021, there was a significant amount of work undertaken, both in terms of the Education Department and by our colleagues in schools, to ensure that moderation of our assessments was undertaken to a great degree, both in terms of the validity and the reliability of the assessment pieces that we use, and also in terms of the entirety of the process, the marking process, the quality assurance of that marking and those instructions. And so that, aligned with the sampling that takes place from SQA over a period of time, as well as our engagements with Education Scotland and their review of our processes, allows us as a department to be very confident indeed of the reliability and the validity of our assessment pieces, and therefore the outcomes also.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wallace is next in line, but I warn you, we'll have to perhaps interrupt your speech at 11 o'clock, period of silence regarding from remembrance. Colleagues, recommence the meeting. Thank you for observing peers. Councillor Wallace, if he is around. Yes, Gordon. Can you hear me, Gordon?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Right, yes, returning to business. Yeah, my comments on the report. The phrase "an increase in attainment" seems to dominate the report, which is, it's great to hear under normal circumstances, but I've got to say, frankly, quite unbelievable considering what our pupils and staff have been through in the year that this report refers to. And I make this comment not as a reflection on East Renfrewshire schools or our staff or indeed our pupils. And I would echo the comments from others in this committee that refers to the dedication of our staff and pupils. But I don't doubt that our virtual comparators are accurate as they reflect what we have understood for years, that our schools locally compare well to other authorities. However, we're in a global marketplace. Our pupils will be competing with students from other countries for work, for jobs. And the concern is that there's a general dumbing down of attainment nationally. And it is not enough that we compare well with other authorities. Now that attainment that's been referred to, the suggestion that has improved, it's got to be in fantasy land. And perhaps indicative of where we are headed. I mean, the political pressure that has been brought to bear on our awarding bodies to paint a picture of success, it's palpable. And I would say it's a warning shot of what's to come and what lies behind these so-called consultations that we are being asked to respond to. As I say, this is no reflection on our schools, no reflection on our pupils. Nobody doubts the dedication and hard work, and particularly in the last year to 18 months to really get through a very difficult period. But to suggest that attainment overall locally, or be it nationally, it just seems absurd. The suggestion would be that perhaps we should go online totally now. If this attainment is what we are to believe, then clearly online must be the answer. But I think we all know that it is not the answer. However, I look forward to looking at the review later on and having a good look at it, and hopefully, as has been suggested earlier, that we can have a good, solid, robust response to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I have the third, giving up the third rank member, Councillor Merrick. Can I mark your life?
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, I'd just like to echo what the Provost has already said about the dedication, the amount of effort from the Director, from the Education Department, right the way through the teachers, down to the pupils themselves and their parents and everybody. This was a time that everybody will remember. Let's hope we don't have another time like it. These kids will talk about this when they are old. They will remember this pandemic. I think the Education Department and what has happened in East Renfrewshire has done the best it can to mitigate the impact on their life chances that the pandemic has obviously impacted. It would be odd if the pandemic hadn't impacted everybody at some level. But thanks to Joe for the presentation. There was just so much in it, in such a short amount of time to consume it all. But thanks very much for it. I want to pick out a couple of points of them now. One in particular, I think what was really good was to individualize the maths, to see what we're trying to do and see the example of some people. So the study skills, what an impact that has. And that's something I kind of always believed in, like sport, like music, like any human endeavor. If you know how to practice and how to get into practicing, then you're going to do better. I think a day spent teaching people how to study is worth a year of study sometimes, well, maybe not a year, but a month. So that it's wonderful to see that. And it is that that you get from the teachers as well, and from yourselves, is that individualising people. And of course, we can't go through all the individuals because we have so many people in our schools because they are the best in the country. So thank you very much for that. The other thing that we noticed was that obviously the people who are impacted, or less resilient perhaps to deal with things like pandemics or anything else, are obviously the folk who we're trying to bring up to close the gap anyway. So, you know, thanks for the continued work there, but we have seen that slip a bit. It would be odd if we hadn't seen it. But I guess, and I know that the recovery plans are in place to do as much as we can to mitigate against that too. And that really is all we can do. We can't make it go away. We'll leave that to the health professionals. But thanks very much for the report. Excellently well done to the education department, the teachers, the staff, the children, the parents. It's been a better year than it might have been without this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Colin. Councillor, I could bring in Mr. Batter, Director, and then to Caroline.
I'm very happy to let Councillor Bamforth go first. It was really just to acknowledge the thanks of the committee in that way, and but I'll let Councillor Bamforth come in first.
Okay, yep, that's fair enough.
Thank you, Dr. Atter, and thank you, Chair. I'm not going to reiterate what everyone else has said. I think, yeah, we all know who the thanks goes to. I just wanted to make a comment on Councillor Wallace's disingenuous comments, though. Considering in England, the rates of A stars and A's the numbers have doubled since 2019. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to almost insinuate that these marks are artificially high. Having children who have been and who are still at Russell Group universities in the UK studying, who were educated in East Renfrewshire, they are well able to cope with the work and keep up with their compatriots, both from the rest of the UK and worldwide, in fact. So I think the East Renfrewshire education is more than adequate to compete, and I think it's a bit disingenuous to almost suggest that these results are dumbed down. So my thanks again for the excellent education that East Renfrewshire has provided, not only to my children but all the other children in East Renfrewshire. And sitting in some of the placing request appeals of Mr. McCaig knows how many thousands there have been this year. We can see how this is not just an opinion shared by ourselves, it's an opinion shared by others. So thank you to everyone who has contributed to these excellent results, both for the ones who have achieved the excellent academic results and for the others who have done equally well in their vocational courses and the other alternative routes that they've taken, which was, as we always say, is the positive destinations is more important than just exam results. It's the holistic approach that I think we can see that happens here in East Renfrewshire. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bamforth. Can I ask, is there other members on the floor? Yes. Mrs. McIntyre.
Right, can I just also say, having a 50-year-old daughter who has gone through the education system in Strathclyde and East Rain, who has now got a 17-year-old who has just sat her hires, I can assure you that the one of 50 doesn't think anything has been dumbed down at all. In fact, she is amazed at the pressure, the work and everything these children have had to do during very difficult circumstances. And she is absolute, she doesn't see any difference at all, or she sees it as in some cases more challenging than it was when she was at school. So it's just an interesting comment to make, that there's a mum looking at a daughter and saying, dumbed down, don't think so. It's just not the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. No further comments from the floor. I would certainly echo the parts of administration colleagues and also councillors for contribution to the meeting. If there's nothing further, can I ask the director to
No, thank you. It was really just to say to acknowledge the comments from elected members. We'll certainly make sure we usually take the opportunity after this particular presentation to write to our staff and to acknowledge the outstanding work. I think, you know, the comments reflect, I think rightly, the professionalism of our staff that they've shown throughout the last year. And if I could just pay tribute to them, it has been remarkable. I think it's easy in November, where I guess the place we've got to with the pandemic is quite different to you know, you feel that separation, whereas where we were in January, February, March with our teachers working online, and then through April to June with the remarkable work that they did in terms of assessing pupils' learning and supporting with them with that. It's been absolutely phenomenal. If I can maybe just give you an example as a parent myself, with 2 boys in primary 4 last year, that despite me being a maths teacher, thinking I have nothing that I can teach them about maths in that way, that the extent to which their teacher went to engage them on a daily basis through the sort of live lessons, the video lessons, you know, that was just an example that all our teachers did. And I think we saw that both in terms of their approach to learning, but I think also their approach to caring for the pupils throughout this. That has been their focus in terms of their sort of well-being. So yeah, it's really very heartening just to hear comments from Education Committee highlighting the work of our staff, and I'll certainly take that back to acknowledge that on your behalf. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That concludes the discussion on that item of the agenda. Any more business? If not, I will do a farewell till you reassemble the discussion on education. Because unfortunately, I have to go to personal engagement, so I'll be handing to the Vice Chair, Councillor to chair the session. Can you remind us the time of that?
Could I suggest maybe, convener, if it's okay with Councillor Merritt, that we give everybody a sort of 5-minute comfort break? I think everybody would appreciate that, a chance to get a cup of tea or coffee, and maybe could I suggest we convene at 11:25? That'll give people enough time just to go and get and join the next meeting. That would be great.
Well, let's go then. Thank you very much for the attention today this morning. Thank you for your efforts in this and in the next meeting here today. Bye just now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.